Even one lady in my own church was asked by an election official, why are you bringing so many people to the polls? Who are they? Are they your family? Which are all questions that are irrelevant when it comes to people exercising the right to vote.
That was Reverend William Barber of the North Carolina NAACP. He was talking about the aggravation felt by so many who saw this year's new election laws as an effort to suppress votes. And there was no shortage of those moves, whether it was voter ID laws in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio, or restrictions to early voting days and voting hours, poll watchers challenging, as you heard, individual voters or trying to intimidate others. What some call gaming the vote was no joke to millions of Americans. Yesterday, Rich spoke with Brenda Wright. She's a nationally known expert on voting rights. She's also the vice president of legal strategies at Demos.
You know, there was one telling comment somebody said to me before the election when seeing the long lines, the new voter ID laws in the books, and questions about suppression, intimidation, etc. They said, I thought we were trying to make voting easier, not harder to do. And although simplistic, I think it got right to the crux of it. Somehow, some way, for all the complaining we have about a disengaged electorate here, we're doing everything we can here to make it harder for these folks to actually cast their vote.
Yeah, and that was the big problem that, of course, we were worried about in the lead up to the election. But what happened that was really inspiring was that there was a huge pushback on the part of the civil rights community and community groups to make sure that those laws were challenged in court where they could be challenged. There were laws that were proposed that were vetoed by governors in certain states. There were efforts by the Department of Justice to use their authority under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act to block some of the worst laws. And so the worst fears were not realized, and a lot of people did have the opportunity to vote. But it took, you know, a whole lot of effort to fight back against these laws in the run-up, and we shouldn't have to face that in every election.
Let's just get to a couple facts, and these aren't really in dispute right now. This premise that there was huge voter fraud that needed to have laws crafted at the state levels here to remedy a problem that by every statistical analysis and evidence even before courts was infinitesimal in reality. I'm not exaggerating it. I mean, every single metric of data we have said this stuff wasn't going on rampantly or even in big numbers here. We were looking for a solution, you know, in search of a problem.
That's right. I mean, one of the most prevalent types of legislation was to enact these laws requiring photo ID and very restrictive requirements on what kind of photo ID would qualify. It had to be government issue and had to have your current address on it and a whole laundry list of things, so that essentially in many states only a driver's license or a passport would really qualify. And, you know, the one point I like to make how vivid, how unnecessary this is that, you know, the only kind of fraud that you can prevent with a photo ID requirement is somebody coming in and impersonating another voter at the polls. And all of the studies that have been done about whether that's a real threat show that it's you are more likely to get hit by lightning on your way to the polling place than to commit voter impersonation fraud when you get there.
Let's get to the second point, which is, by every standard again, these laws were designed and really practiced, particularly in inner cities. This wasn't going after really voters in suburbs primarily or people in affluent areas. These were primarily targeted and really enforced for the large part, to have at least from a different standpoint, in a lot of the urban areas of this country.
I mean, that's right, and they came in direct reaction to an election in 2008 where unprecedented numbers of people of color, students, young people turned out to vote. And these laws were very directly an effort to shrink the electorate instead of to grow the electorate. These laws took us directly in the opposite direction. They really threatened to take us backwards. And There is a lot more that needs to be done going forward to make sure these laws are enjoined by the courts where necessary, and that we go into the next legislative session with a pro-voter agenda instead of an anti-voter agenda. We need to do things like enact same-day registration laws, so that if you have moved and you failed to update your address before the election, you can just update it there at the polls on election day. You have a fail-safe if your name for some reason doesn't appear on the registration list. And states that have these laws allowing same-day registration have voter turnout much higher than other states. So states throughout the country ought to be making voting more accessible, ought to be cutting the red tape around voting instead of making it harder for people.
You know, Brenda, some of the exit polling that we saw showed almost a perversity. The laws that were intended, if you believe as I do, for cynical reasons to try and drive down turnout, actually had the opposite effect. People felt they were being targeted for disenfranchisement, and they turned out in numbers that were probably larger than they would have been had there been no voter ID laws in the books. I know on election night you were fielding calls here from some of the problems around. You must have heard some of these same kind of sentiments.
Yes, we did. People were very determined to exercise their right to vote. We had calls from over 90,000 people across the country calling in to report problems or to ask questions or to get help in exercising their right to vote. There were people, as you know, standing in line for hours and hours in places like Florida and Virginia and Ohio. And, you know, it shouldn't be that way. I mean, it's great that people have that sense of dedication that compels them to put up with those burdens when trying to vote, but people should not have to face 3, 4, 5 hour waits in line for voting.
Well, that brings me to my final question. And the president, in his acceptance speech in Chicago, said he referenced those long lines, and he said, we're going to have to do something about that. If there was leadership from the White House or from his administration on this, what would you like it to look like?
We would really like to see the White House take a very strong stand to say that, you know, there's been a big effort to disenfranchise people over the last 2 years, and we are going to move forward with a positive agenda so that we can institutionalize enfranchisement of voters, so that we can have procedures in place that make it possible for more people to participate. Same-day registration, making registration permanent and portable so that when you move, you don't have to keep updating your address. That gets done for you automatically. Automatic registration so that when you are at a government agency and they have information indicating that you're eligible to vote, you can just get added to the rolls in a paperless process so that you're not relying on paper applications and putting the burden on the voter to take those steps to get registered themselves. So the White House could definitely play a lead role. We were very heartened to see the president refer to the need to do something about these long lines, and it's up to us to hold him to it.
And we shall watch it. In fact, Brenda Wright, thank you so much for a few minutes. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we're going to wrap things up on RFL when we return. Stay with us.